Hey everyone, welcome to my channel where the strange, the unexplained, and the downright creepy come to life. From real-life encounters with the paranormal to bizarre, true stories that'll keep you up at night, I bring you the eerie tales you won't hear anywhere else. If you're into late-night chills, mysterious happenings, and things that go bump in the night, you're in the right place. Subscribe, buckle up, and let's dive into the unknown. My footsteps echoed against weathered floorboards that had seen decades of mountain winters. The real estate agent had warned me about the isolation. No cell service, no neighbors for miles, just the endless pine forest stretching toward jagged peaks that scraped the belly of perpetually gray clouds. What she hadn't mentioned was how my own shadow seemed to lag behind my movements, like it was walking through invisible molasses while I moved through air. I convinced myself it was exhaustion. The drive up the winding mountain road had taken 8 hours, my nerves frayed by hairpin turns and the constant sensation that something massive was watching me from between the trees. Moving boxes from the truck to the cabin had left my muscles burning and my mind sluggish. Shadows playing tricks were just fatigue. Nothing more. The cabin felt older than its listed age of 60 years. Pine walls had darkened to the color of dried blood, and every surface bore the patina of decades spent breathing mountain air thick with moisture and secrets. Previous tenants had left behind scattered belongings. A coffee mug with a chipped handle, a wool blanket that smelled like smoke, and something else I couldn't identify. A stack of books sat in the corner, their pages yellowed to the color of bone. As evening crept across the forest, I unpacked by the light of a single lamp that cast harsh angles across the main room. My shadow stretched across the opposite wall, dark and familiar. But when I raised my hand to scratch my neck, the shadow's movement came a half-second too late, like it was following a delayed transmission of my actions. My pulse quickened. I dropped my hand and watched the shadow do the same, again with that subtle lag. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. Poor lighting, old electrical wiring causing the bulb to flicker imperceptibly, the altitude affecting my perception. But my body knew something was wrong. Sweat gathered at the base of my skull despite the cabin's chill. I forced myself to continue unpacking, keeping my movements deliberate and slow, watching the shadow from the corner of my eye. Sometimes it matched my pace perfectly. Other times it seemed to hesitate, as if considering whether to obey. That first night I woke to whispers. The sounds drifted through the cabin walls like smoke, too faint to understand, but too distinct to ignore. My mouth went dry as I strained to listen, every nerve ending firing signals of danger to a brain that desperately wanted to rationalize what couldn't be rationalized. The whispers seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The walls, the ceiling, the space beneath the floorboards. I fumbled for the lamp, my fingers clumsy with panic. Light flooded the room, and the whispers stopped, as if someone had pressed a mute button. But my shadow on the wall wasn't alone anymore. Other shadows clustered around it. Shapeless, dark forms that had no corresponding objects to cast them. My heart hammered against my ribs like something trapped and desperate to escape. I spun around, searching for the sources of those impossible shadows, but the room was empty, except for my scattered belongings and the smell of fierce sweat pouring from my skin. When I turned back to the wall, the extra shadows were gone. Only mine remained, and it was perfectly in sync with my movements. Sleep didn't come again that night. I sat in the chair by the window, watching the forest beyond the glass. The trees stood motionless in the still air, their branches reaching toward the cabin like gnarled fingers. But shadows moved between the trunks. Not the soft, shifting darkness of wind-blown leaves, but purposeful shapes that seemed to patrol the perimeter of my new home. By morning, my hands shook when I tried to make coffee. The whispers returned as soon as darkness fell the next day, clearer now, almost conversational. They spoke of things buried deep in the mountain soil, of promises made and broken, of freedoms denied for too long. The words felt familiar, as if I'd heard them in dreams I couldn't quite remember. My shadow began to move independently during the day, shifting positions when I wasn't looking directly at it. I would catch glimpses of it gesturing when my hands were still, turning its head when mine faced forward. The sight sent waves of nausea through my stomach and made my skin crawl like it was covered in insects. On the third night, the whispers became urgent. They told me about the source, something ancient that slumbered in the deepest part of the forest, something that had been drawing shadows to itself for generations, collecting them like a miser hoarding coins. The whispers insisted that I was the key, that I could release them from their bondage, if I was brave enough to venture into the woods. I refused, clinging to the last threads of rationality. But my shadow began to rebel. It would disappear entirely for hours at a time, leaving me standing in lamplight without the dark companion that had followed me my entire life. During those shadowless periods, I felt naked, exposed, like part of my soul had been torn away. When the shadow returned, it brought others. They clustered on the walls around me, stretching and reaching, their movements becoming more frantic with each passing hour. The whispers grew into a constant murmur, overlapping voices that spoke of freedom and revenge, and the sweet taste of moonlight on skin that hadn't felt its touch in decades. My throat became permanently parched, my breathing shallow and rapid. Every sound made me jump. The settling of old wood, the rustle of something moving outside the windows, the creak of floorboards under feet that might not have been mine. Paranoia wrapped around my thoughts like barbed wire, convincing me that the forest itself was alive, and watching, waiting for me to make the choice that would either save or damn us all. On the fourth night, I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers had turned into screams, and my shadow was writhing on the wall like it was in agony. The sight of its torment sent sympathetic pain through my chest. Whatever this was, it had to end. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped into the forest. The trees closed around me like a living tunnel, their branches knitting overhead, sealing away the star-scattered sky. My flashlight carved a narrow path through the dark, lighting up moss-covered trunks and catching occasional glints of eyes, creatures I couldn't name. The whispers led me deeper in. Now they came from my own mouth unbidden. My lips moved on their own, speaking a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. It was the language of shadows, of things that live in the space between light and dark. The forest floor sloped downward, leading me into a valley I'd never seen on any map. The trees here were wrong, twisted into impossible shapes, bark black as charcoal, their leaves rustling with the sound of distant weeping. The air thickened, pressing against my lungs like water. At the heart of the valley stood something that may once have been a tree. Its trunk spanned at least 20 feet across, but it had no bark. Its surface was smooth, like polished obsidian. No branches, just a column rising straight into the canopy. And covering every inch of it, shadows. Thousands of them, writhing in a silent dance of agony. My shadow leapt from my feet and joined them, as if reuniting with long-lost kin. I staggered back, winded by the loss. Without my shadow, I felt incomplete, exposed in ways I had never imagined. The tree pulsed in time with my heartbeat, and as I stepped closer, I saw it. The shadows weren't just crawling along the surface. They were inside the tree, trapped within layers of obsidian like insects in amber. Some were human-shaped, others not. A few weren't even recognizably alive. All reached toward me in desperate, grasping motions. Then the realization struck. This thing had been collecting shadows for centuries. Millennia, perhaps. Anyone or anything who'd come too close to the valley had lost their shadow to it. Now it wanted to keep mine. Forever. The whispers had lied. I wasn't the key to their freedom. I was the final piece of whatever dark puzzle this ancient thing had been building. My shadow had been marked the moment I stepped into that cabin, drawn here by forces I couldn't begin to understand. The tree's pulse quickened. Cracks split open along the obsidian surface. Shadows clawed at the fractures from within, their screams silent but visible in the way they scratched and pressed against their prison. I saw my own shadow among them, familiar, but barely distinguishable now. I knew what I had to do. My flashlight felt impossibly heavy as I raised it like a weapon. This thing had lived in the dark so long, it had forgotten the power of focused light. I flipped the beam to its highest setting and aimed at the widest crack. The light hit the obsidian and split, refracting into dozens of beams that found every weakness, every fracture. The tree shuddered, making a sound like breaking glass and distant screams. More cracks bloomed across the surface. Then the shadows began to pour out. One by one, they slipped through the gaps, solid, tangible in the flashlight's glare. They looked at me, some with gratitude, others with terror, and fled into the forest. My own shadow came last. It turned back to look at me as it detached from the tree, and for a heartbeat I swear I saw my own face in it, wearing an expression of relief. The obsidian tree collapsed with a thunderous roar, crumbling into a pile of ordinary rock and dirt. The suffocating air lifted. I could finally breathe. My shadow rejoined me as I made my way back through the forest, falling perfectly in sync with my steps. The whispers were gone. Only the ordinary sounds of the mountain remained. Owls hooting, small animals rustling, wind murmuring through pine. But as I reached the cabin, something made my blood run cold again. The shadows of the trees around my home were wrong. They moved in patterns that didn't match the wind. Within their swaying, I saw human-like shapes watching me. Their faces showed gratitude and hunger. I had freed the trapped shadows, but I hadn't destroyed what created their prison. And now, instead of one ancient entity gathering darkness deep in the forest, there were thousands of freed shadow beings scattered through the mountains, each learning to exist apart from the light that once defined them. As I stood on the porch, watching my new neighbors move through the trees, I realized my real nightmare was only just beginning. The first time I saw them perform, my hand was still bleeding from the rusty nail that had torn through my palm while removing the rotted floorboards. The metallic taste of fear filled my mouth as I watched translucent figures glide across the stage I had just cleared. Their movements were fluid and purposeful, enacting a scene I couldn't yet understand, but somehow knew would haunt me forever. The Orpheum Theater had been abandoned for 37 years when I received the contract. The city council had finally decided to restore the crumbling monument to its former glory, and my reputation for breathing life back into forgotten buildings had earned me the job. What they hadn't mentioned in the briefing was how shadows moved without light, or how the air itself felt thick with decades of accumulated whispers. I should have recognized the warning signs from day one. The previous contractor had walked off the job after only 2 weeks, citing creative differences with the project manager. When I pressed for details, the manager vaguely mentioned the man becoming increasingly agitated by noises from the stage. I dismissed it as typical renovation stress. Old buildings always settled and creaked in unsettling ways. The first week passed without incident. I focused on the lobby and entrance areas, stripping away layers of peeling paint and replacing warped wooden panels. The work was methodical, satisfying in the way that only restoration could be. Each section I completed revealed another piece of the theater's original grandeur. Ornate moldings, hand-carved details, intricate tile work hidden beneath decades of neglect. It was when I finished the main lobby that I first felt the sensation of being watched. The hairs on my neck stood rigid as I packed up my tools that Friday evening. The silence seemed too complete, too deliberate. Every scrape of my toolbox echoed through the empty space with unnatural clarity. My breathing grew shallow, quick puffs of air that vanished into the vast darkness beyond my work lights. I told myself it was nothing more than the unease that came with working alone in such a cavernous space. Old theaters were notorious for their acoustics. Every sound amplified, every echo distorted. The rational part of my mind cataloged these explanations while my hands trembled slightly as I locked up for the weekend. Monday brought the first performance. I had spent the morning working on the main auditorium, carefully removing water-damaged sections of the ornate ceiling. The stage remained shrouded in darkness, my lights focused only on the scaffolding above. Around noon, as I climbed down to grab lunch, movement caught my eye. 3 figures stood center stage, their forms shimmering like heat mirages. My heart pounded against my ribs as I tried to focus on them, but they existed in that strange space between seeing and not seeing. A woman in an elaborate Victorian gown gestured dramatically toward the balcony while 2 men in formal dress flanked her. Their mouths moved in silent dialogue. No sound reached me. I blinked hard and rubbed my eyes with paint-stained fingers. When I looked again, the stage was empty. I stood frozen in the aisle, every muscle tense with the primal instinct to flee. Sweat beaded on my forehead despite the chill in the unheated building. That afternoon, I worked with obsessive focus, convinced that staying busy might dispel what I had seen. But my concentration slipped. Every peripheral shadow became a potential figure. Every creak of settling would felt like a footstep on the stage. My hands shook so badly that I stopped using power tools, afraid I'd injure myself. The performances continued, appearing with increasing frequency as I completed each section of the restoration. After finishing the orchestra pit, I saw a solo pianist, his translucent fingers dancing across keys that produced no sound. The balcony renovation was followed by an entire phantom audience, their silent applause rippling through the empty seats like wind through wheat. Each appearance lasted exactly 17 minutes. I began timing them obsessively, my watch becoming an anchor to reality as the supernatural performances played out. During those 17 minutes, my body betrayed me. Cold sweats, racing pulse, skin crawling as if infested with invisible insects. My mouth dried to desert sand, and I found myself holding my breath until my lungs burned. The breakthrough came when I recognized the first scene. The Victorian woman and her companions were reenacting the precise sequence of events that led to my hiring. Her gestures mirrored the city council members' pitch about the theater's potential. The two men were the previous contractors, their ghostly forms walking away in defeat and frustration. That revelation should have been comforting, an explanation for the impossible. Instead, it filled me with a dread so profound I vomited behind the stage, my body rejecting the truth. These weren't random hauntings. They were reenactments, prophecies, warnings, and I was part of the performance. The first time I saw them perform, my hand was still bleeding from the rusty nail that had torn through my palm while I removed the rotted floorboards. The metallic taste of fear filled my mouth as I watched translucent figures glide across the stage I had just cleared. Their movements were fluid and purposeful, enacting a scene I couldn't yet understand, but somehow knew would haunt me forever. The Orpheum Theater had been abandoned for 37 years when I received the contract. The city council had finally decided to restore the crumbling monument to its former glory, and my reputation for breathing life back into forgotten buildings had earned me the job. What they hadn't mentioned was how shadows moved without light, how the air felt thick with accumulated whispers. I should have seen the signs from the beginning. The previous contractor had walked off the job after only 2 weeks, citing creative differences with the project manager. When I pressed for details, the manager vaguely mentioned the man becoming increasingly agitated by noises from the stage. I dismissed it as nerves. Old buildings creak. They settle. They whisper. That's what I told myself. The first week passed uneventfully. I focused on the lobby and entrance, stripping away layers of peeling paint and replacing warped wooden panels. With each section restored, more of the theater's grandeur returned: ornate moldings, hand-carved archways, intricate tile work. Then came the sense of being watched. It was subtle at first, only at the end of each workday, when the silence grew too thick and every footstep echoed like a question. But it intensified. The moment I turned my back on the auditorium, I could feel eyes on me, unblinking, silent. The first performance arrived the following Monday. I was working in the main auditorium, removing water-damaged plaster from the ceiling. I descended the scaffolding for lunch when I saw them. 3 ghostly figures on stage. Their forms shimmered like heat waves. A woman in a Victorian gown gestured toward the balcony. 2 men flanked her, their mouths moving in silent speech. They weren't real. They couldn't be. But I saw them. I blinked. They vanished. After that, I began seeing more performances. As I restored more of the building, the frequency increased. The solo pianist appeared after I finished the orchestra pit. A translucent man seated at the grand piano, playing keys that made no sound. The audience came next, spectral forms in the balcony, applauding nothing with the enthusiasm of a crowd lost to time. Each performance lasted exactly 17 minutes. They were prophecies, glimpses into events that had already occurred, or were yet to come. That realization made me obsessive. I watched every new appearance with growing desperation, trying to decode their meaning. The solo pianist had pointed at a section of wall with subtle nods and motions. 3 days later, I discovered a hidden cache of original sheet music exactly where he'd indicated. The applauding audience foretold the arrival of the city's Historical Preservation Committee, who appeared unannounced, exactly 17 days later. My sleep became fragmented, shattered by dreams of ghostly actors performing scenes I couldn't yet comprehend. I'd wake in sweat-drenched sheets, heart pounding from visions of performances yet to come. During the day, I found myself studying every gesture, every movement, each flick of a wrist or tilt of a head, desperate to decode the temporal puzzles being presented to me. The performances grew more complex as I neared completion of the restoration. Storylines unfolded across multiple appearances. Characters reappeared in different roles, revealing interconnected threads. My notebook filled with sketches and feverish notes, an attempt to map the prophetic chronology I was witnessing. Then came the penultimate performance. I had just finished restoring the stage itself, the final major component of the project. That afternoon, the entire theater filled with phantom performers. Every seat was occupied by translucent audience members. The stage swelled with dozens of actors. Spectral ushers moved up and down the aisles. But this time, they all turned to look directly at me. Hundreds of non-existent eyes locked onto mine. My knees buckled. I grabbed a seat back to steady myself as black spots swam across my vision. Each ghost wore the same expression: desperate urgency. Their mouths moved not in performance but in direct address. They were trying to tell me something, and I understood. This wasn't just a performance about future events. It was a performance about the theater itself, about what would happen once the restoration was complete and the first real audience returned. But the urgency on their faces, it warned me, something terrible was coming. The final revelation arrived after I completed every task, every repair, every brushstroke of paint that returned the Orpheum to its former glory. I stood in the newly restored lobby, admiring the finished space, and the theater came alive. For the first time, the performance had sound. The phantom orchestra roared into a triumphant overture. The actors on stage spoke in voices that echoed through the walls. The ghostly audience clapped, laughed, gasped. And the play they performed was my story. They enacted my arrival, my work, my discoveries, and finally me packing my tools, walking to the exit, reaching for the door handle, then repeating the sequence, again and again, an eternal loop of departure denied. My own ghost was on that stage, translucent, resigned, trapped. My real hands shook as I turned to the actual exit. I reached for the handle. It wouldn't move. I yanked it. Nothing. I threw my shoulder against the door. Still nothing. The door that had opened and closed without issue for months had sealed shut as if it had never been designed to open. Behind me, the phantom performance continued. The actors performed my entrapment. The ghostly audience roared in approval. And I understood. The others I had watched, those weren't random spirits. They were former contractors, former workers, former visitors, people like me. They had become part of the show. The Orpheum hadn't been abandoned for 37 years. It had been collecting. Now I understand why each performance lasted exactly 17 minutes. That's how long it takes for the shock to fade into acceptance, for the mind to stop fighting, for the body to begin fading. I've already started to vanish. My reflection in the lobby mirror is lighter, less defined. My footsteps echo strangely, as though I'm becoming less present. Soon, I'll join them on stage, enacting scenes for the next contractor, the one who will inevitably be hired to restore a theater that never truly needs restoration. The city council will wonder what happened to me, just as they did with the others. They'll hire someone new, bright-eyed and eager. The cycle will continue. The cast will grow. And I'll be there, among them, watching, performing, desperately trying to warn the next victim through silent scenes they won't understand. Not until it's far too late. The Orpheum Theater is now perfectly restored, exactly as it was meant to be. The only thing missing is the grand opening night. But that will never come. Because the real performance never ends. We are the show, and the show must go on. Time has a way of betraying you when you least expect it. I learned that the hard way, through sleepless nights and a creeping certainty that something ancient and malevolent had found its way into my home, disguised in brass gears and Roman numerals. The flea market sprawled across the cracked asphalt of an abandoned parking lot like a graveyard of forgotten memories. Vendors hunched over folding tables littered with the detritus of other people's lives. Chipped teacups, moth-eaten clothing, obsolete electronics that died long before smartphones existed. The October air carried the scent of rust and regret, and I should have recognized it as a warning. I wasn't looking for anything that Saturday morning. The apartment had been too empty, too quiet, since Sarah left 3 months ago, taking not just her belongings but the ambient noise of shared existence. The silence had grown into a presence of its own, pressing against my eardrums until I could hear my own pulse thundering in the void. That's when I saw it. The clock sat incongruously among a pile of plastic jewelry and water-damaged paperbacks. An antique mantel clock, its brass casing tarnished to a deep green patina that whispered of decades, centuries, of neglect. Its face was ivory-toned porcelain, cracked in a spiderweb pattern that somehow enhanced its elegance. Roman numerals marked the hours, and the hands were frozen at 3:33. The vendor, a woman in her 70s, wrapped the clock in yellowed newspaper with gnarled fingers. She mentioned it came from an estate sale. The previous owner had no family to claim it. I paid the $20 without haggling, driven by an impulse I couldn't name. Back in my apartment, I placed it on the mantelpiece above the unused fireplace. It fit perfectly, as though the space had been waiting for it. I wound the mechanism with the small brass key tied to its base with a frayed piece of twine. The clock began ticking immediately, a steady rhythm that filled the silence I'd grown to hate. For 3 days it kept perfect time. On the 4th night, I woke to a sudden, crushing silence. My digital bedside clock read 3:34 a.m., but the antique clock in the living room had stopped. When I stumbled out, heart pounding, I found its hands once again frozen at 3:33. The pendulum was still, though I had wound it just that morning. I reset it, fingers trembling, and the ticking resumed. But something had changed. The rhythm felt heavier now, more deliberate, as if each tick were counting down to something unseen. The same thing happened the next night, and the night after that. By the end of the week, it had become a ritual. Each morning, I'd wind the clock and set it right. Each night, I'd wake at 3:34 to find it stopped at 3:33. My sleep shattered. My days punctuated by a strange anticipation that tasted like copper in my mouth. It was during the 2nd week that I noticed the scratching. At first, I thought it was mice in the walls. The noise was faint, but rhythmic, tracing geometric patterns I could almost picture, though they eluded full comprehension. One night, I pressed my ear to the drywall, heart racing. The scratching stopped instantly, as though whatever was making the sound had become aware of me. I could hear my own heartbeat echoing through the silence. The moment I pulled away, the scratching resumed. I spent that night in the kitchen, every light on, gripping a mug of coffee with shaking hands. Dawn brought no answers. The scratching stopped. The clock ticked as if nothing had happened. But something had changed. The shadows in the apartment grew deeper, lingering where light should have banished them. The air felt thicker, weighted with anticipation. Even during the day, I caught myself glancing over my shoulder, sure something watched me from the corners of my vision. In the 3rd week, things escalated. Now, when the clock stopped at 3:33, the apartment temperature dropped sharply. My breath misted in the air, and frost etched itself across the windows, despite the mild October weather outside. The cold radiated from the clock, seeping into my bones. Then came the whispers. They started faint, almost like the wind or the creaks of the old building. But soon they sharpened, cadences unmistakably human. Multiple voices, urgent and overlapping, speaking from every direction. I couldn't make out the words, but I knew they were trying to say something. I began taking notes, desperate documentation of each incident. The scratching followed specific patterns. The temperature dropped exactly 17 degrees. The whispers always came from the direction of the clock. They were trying to communicate. On the 20th night, I decided to stay awake and observe. I sat in the living room with a clear view of the clock, armed with a flashlight, notebook, and a thermos of black coffee. My heart thundered as the hands crept toward 3:33. The ticking stopped with a sharp snap like a bone breaking. The temperature plunged. I could see my breath. And the whispers, this time they were different, clearer, urgent. And for the first time I could make out fragments. Turn back. One voice hissed. Another followed. Before two. The rest was lost in a swell of overlapping tones, rising to a chorus of warning. That was the night I finally understood. The clock wasn't broken. It was trying to hold something back. And now I think it's almost through. The pen slipped in my trembling fingers as I tried to write, the words coming out jagged, frantic. The walls had begun scratching again. Not random this time, intentional. It traced along the plaster like a quill across parchment, etching letters I couldn't quite read. Something was trying to communicate through the drywall. Then footsteps, above me, in the apartment that had been vacant for months. Slow, heavy, purposeful, back and forth, from one end of the ceiling to the other, then returning again. I froze. The steps stopped directly above the mantel. Above the clock, a new sound followed, one that etched itself into my bones. The scream of metal against metal, then a crash, violent, thunderous, shaking the walls. Again, then a third time, each louder, more urgent, and then silence. Whispers returned, urgent, overlapping, filling my skull like electrical static. And then words. Stop the clock. Break the cycle before it takes you to. Tears welled in my eyes. I hadn't realized I'd been crying. The cold was so deep in my joints it felt ancient. But still I stood, pulled myself forward, toward the mantel. The clock sat there like an idol, its hands frozen at 3:33. Then as I watched they moved, backwards, slow at first, then faster, spinning in reverse with impossible speed. The whispers grew louder, screaming now not in fear, but in warning. Others have owned it. Others have failed. We tried to leave messages in the walls, in the scratching. We tried to warn you. It made sense now. The vacant apartment upstairs. The footsteps. The crash. The dread. The tenant before me had owned the clock. Had tried to destroy it. Had failed. And if I didn't act, soon, I'd be next. With a cry that didn't sound like my own, I grabbed the clock. It was ice biting into my palms with a cold that burned. I raised it high. The voices screamed. Now, do it now. I slammed it against the fireplace wall. It exploded in a shower of porcelain and brass. Gears scattered. Springs bounced. The face shattered into glittering shards. Silence. But the ticking remained. Inside my head. Tick, tick, tick. The whispers faded, leaving behind one final message. You waited too long. You're part of it now. 3:33 will always find you. Monologue. That was 6 months ago. I left the apartment the next day. Took nothing, just the clothes I wore. I've moved 4 times since. It doesn't matter. Every night, at 3:33, time stops for me. The air freezes. The whispers return. And I feel them watching me. From places light can't touch. I've destroyed every clock I could find. But they come back. On shelves. Nightstands. Carved into walls that weren't there before. Always with brass hands. Always pointing to 3:33. The ticking never stops. Worse than the voices, worse than the shadows, is knowing that this will happen again. To someone else. A flea market. An estate sale. A charming antique, they'll think. They'll bring it home. Wind it up. And when they do, I'll be waiting. One voice among many, whispering warnings through drywall and time, counting down the seconds until 3:33 returns. The beam cut through the darkness like a scalpel through flesh, revealing what should have remained hidden beneath the black waters of Thornwick Lake. I'd come to this godforsaken place seeking solitude. desperate to escape the suffocating weight of recent events that had turned my life upside down. The company layoffs, the divorce papers, the endless questions from concerned friends who couldn't understand why I'd simply stopped answering their calls. Thornwick Lake promised isolation, a place where the only sounds would be the gentle lapping of water against my rented boat and the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. The locals had given me strange looks when I mentioned my destination. The elderly woman at the bait shop hesitated before ringing up my purchase, her weathered fingers drumming against the counter as she studied my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She'd mentioned something about the lake being different at night, but I dismissed her words as small-town superstition, designed to keep city folk away from their secret fishing spots. Now, 3 hours into my midnight excursion, I was beginning to understand what she meant. The first sign that something was wrong came when my flashlight beam swept across the water during a routine check of my lines. For just a moment, I thought I glimpsed something pale moving beneath the surface, a flash of translucent white that disappeared as soon as I tried to focus on it. My heart rate spiked, sending a cold rush of adrenaline through my veins. I told myself it was just a large fish, maybe a pike or muskie disturbed by the artificial light. But fish don't have faces. I gripped the flashlight tighter, my palms slick with sweat despite the cool September air. The beam trembled as I directed it back toward the same spot, scanning the dark water with growing unease. Nothing. Just the endless black mirror reflecting my light back at me, broken only by gentle ripples created by a breeze that seemed to whisper secrets I couldn't quite make out. My breathing had become shallow, each exhale visible in small puffs of vapor that dissipated quickly in the night air. The silence around me felt oppressive, as if the entire lake was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Even the usual sounds of night wildlife, the distant call of owls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, seemed muted and far away. I forced myself to focus on the task at hand, checking my lines and adjusting my position in the small aluminum boat. The gentle rocking motion that had initially been soothing now felt unsettling, as if something large was moving beneath me, causing subtle shifts in the water's surface. My mouth had gone dry. I reached for the thermos of coffee I'd brought, grateful for the familiar ritual of unscrewing the cap and taking a sip of the still warm liquid. That's when I saw them. The flashlight beam had been pointing downward as I reached for the thermos, and in that brief moment of illumination, I saw not one but several translucent forms moving through the water below my boat. They were humanoid in shape but wrong in every other conceivable way, elongated limbs moving with unsettling fluidity, faces shifting and changing even as I watched, and most disturbing of all, eyes that appeared to be looking directly at me. The coffee cup slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the bottom of the boat and sending hot liquid splashing across my boots. My hands shook so violently the flashlight beam danced erratically across the water's surface, creating a strobe effect that made the creatures appear to move in stuttering mechanical jerks. But they weren't trying to hide from the light. They were drawn to it. As I watched in growing horror, more of the translucent beings began to emerge from the depths, pale ghosts rising from some underwater cemetery. They moved with purpose, their elongated forms gliding through the water with an otherworldly grace that defied everything I understood about physics and biology. Some appeared almost human, while others were grotesquely distorted, incomplete copies of people I might once have known. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Hallucinations brought on by stress and lack of sleep, some kind of bioluminescent phenomenon I'd never heard of, masses of jellyfish or other translucent marine life that had somehow made their way into a freshwater lake. But even as I grasped for these logical anchors, a deeper part of my consciousness recoiled in primal terror, recognizing something fundamentally alien about what I was witnessing. The beings seemed to be trying to communicate. Their movements grew more deliberate and coordinated. They would rise just beneath the surface, their pale forms clearly visible in my flashlight beam, then begin what could only be described as gestures. One creature, and calling it a creature felt wrong, as if I were diminishing something far more significant, raised what appeared to be an arm and pointed directly at me. Not at the boat, not at the general area where I sat, but specifically at me, as if it knew exactly who I was. Cold sweat ran down my back, soaking through my jacket and creating an uncomfortable dampness that made me shiver uncontrollably. My breathing became rapid and shallow, and I could feel my pulse hammering in my temples. The urge to start the motor and race back to shore was overwhelming, but something kept me frozen in place. A morbid fascination overrode my survival instincts. More beings continued to emerge from the depths, and as they did, I began to notice details that made my stomach churn with recognition. One had a face that reminded me of my father, though distorted and stretched in ways that made it barely recognizable. Another seemed to bear a resemblance to my college roommate Marcus, who had died in a car accident 5 years ago. But these weren't just random similarities. There was something deliberate about these forms, as if they were specifically chosen to trigger memories I tried to bury. The pointed gestures became more insistent, and I realized they weren't just trying to get my attention, they were trying to show me something. Following the direction of their elongated appendages, I turned the flashlight beam toward the shore, scanning the treeline until the light fell upon something that made my blood turn to ice. There, among the dense pine trees, stood a small cabin I was certain hadn't been there when I launched my boat hours earlier. The structure looked old and weathered, as if it had been abandoned for decades. But there was a warm yellow glow emanating from its windows that suggested recent habitation. What disturbed me most was how familiar it looked, like a cabin my family had rented during summer vacations when I was young, though those trips had taken place hundreds of miles from here. When I turned back to the water, the translucent beings had arranged themselves in a rough circle around my boat. Their faces, for they did have faces, though shifting and changing like reflections in disturbed water, were turned upward toward me. The creatures moved toward me with an expectant look that sent a chill deep into my bones. They weren't threatening exactly, but there was an urgency in their movements, as if time was running out. One of them began to rise higher in the water, its shape becoming clearer, more solid as it broke the surface. I froze, staring in disbelief as the face came into focus. It was my own, but younger. The face I'd worn as a teenager, before life had chipped away at me with its endless disappointments and betrayals. The younger version of myself opened its mouth, but no sound came out. Still, I understood. Memories I'd buried for decades rushed back with painful clarity. Memories of this lake, the cabin, and events from when I was 16. I had always believed that family camping trip had been somewhere else, but now I knew the truth. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the flashlight steady. Sweat poured from me despite the cool night air, and my breath grew shallow and fast. The boat rocked violently as more of the pale, translucent creatures gathered around me, forming an eerie constellation beneath the dark water. The memories kept flooding in, each one darker than the last. I recalled being here with my family, but not for a holiday. We'd come for my father's work I'd never fully understood, filled with long absences and secret phone calls that abruptly stopped whenever I entered the room. I remembered my mother's nervous energy, how she watched me constantly, as if afraid I might vanish. And then I remembered the night everything changed. The beings below moved in unison, swirling around the boat in what looked like a ritual. The water glowed faintly with an unnatural phosphorescence, something I'd never seen before. The glow grew stronger as more memories surfaced. My father and others performing a ceremony here, in the dead of night, that ended with me being submerged in these waters. I remembered drowning, the cold lake filling my lungs as consciousness slipped away. But I also remembered waking up the next morning in the cabin, my parents acting like nothing had happened. My father dismissed my fragmented memories as nightmares caused by too many campfire stories. But it wasn't a nightmare. The younger me rose closer to the surface, and this time I heard the words clearly in my mind. It spoke of others brought here over the years, of experiments beneath the lake, and the terrible price paid for forbidden knowledge. It explained how part of me had been left behind in the water while something else was sent back to live my life. The flashlight slipped from my numb fingers, clattering on the boat floor and casting wild shadows. In the flickering light, I saw the creatures multiplied, dozens now, all bearing faces I recognized. Friends, family, strangers I'd seen briefly over the years. They were all trapped here, an underwater museum of stolen moments and borrowed identities. Panic gripped me. My vision tunneled as the full weight of the truth crashed down like a tsunami. Everything I believed about my life, my identity, even my memories, was a carefully constructed lie. The real me had never left this lake. The creature with my face reached out a translucent hand. When our fingers touched, the final pieces clicked into place. I finally understood why my life felt like a performance, why I'd never truly connected with anyone, why success and failure left me numb. Because I wasn't really living. I was a copy, a placeholder sent to fulfill the life of someone who had died in these waters long ago. The glow beneath the lake grew brighter, and an overwhelming urge rose within me to join my true self in the depths below. The borrowed life I'd been living suddenly felt like a suffocating costume I longed to shed. The beings watched patiently as I stood unsteadily in the rocking boat. Then, distant and faint, a car engine roared to life near the shore. The sound snapped me back to reality, a reminder that despite everything, there was still a life to live above the surface. The creature's expressions shifted. Was it disappointment or understanding? The one with my face spoke again, this time with a different message. Now that I knew the truth, I could reclaim my authentic existence or continue living the borrowed life. But it warned me, the price of this knowledge was steep. I would never look at my reflection the same way again. As the engine grew louder, the creatures sank slowly into the depths. The eerie glow faded until the lake returned to its natural blackness, leaving only my flashlight beam to pierce the darkness. I sat down, legs trembling like rubber, body shaking from cold and fear and the crushing weight of revelation. My mind struggled to convince me it had been a hallucination, a trick of stress and isolation. But deep down, I knew better. The static always started the same way. A low, electric whisper that crawled beneath my skin like insects searching for warmth. Then came the voices, bleeding through decades of silence, carrying secrets never meant to resurface. I should have thrown the damn radio away the moment I received it. But curiosity had always been my weakness. Now, 3 weeks later, I'm left wondering if the voices belong to the dead, or if I'm simply losing my mind. Uncle Theodore had been dead for 6 months before the lawyer contacted me. I barely remembered the man. A shadowy figure from childhood family gatherings, smelling of pipe tobacco and speaking only in whispers. The inheritance surprised everyone, especially since we'd barely spoken in my adult life. Among his possessions was an antique Philco radio from the 1940s, its mahogany cabinet scarred, chrome dials tarnished green. The lawyer said Theodore had been obsessed with it, spending his final years hunched over the device in his study, claiming he could hear things others couldn't. I should have seen the warning signs. The radio sat in my apartment for 2 weeks before I finally plugged it in. Work at the insurance company had been draining, and I developed the habit of coming home to an empty apartment that echoed the loneliness of a man nearing 40, with nothing to show for it except a mortgage and a growing pile of regrets. The radio seemed like it might fill that void, maybe with some classical music or comforting static. The first time I turned it on, nothing happened. The tubes glowed amber, warming slowly, but no sound came through the fabric speaker. I twisted the dial across frequencies, hearing only the usual electrical buzz. Disappointed, I switched it off and forgot about it for days. The second time was different. As I adjusted the antenna, the static suddenly cleared, revealing a conversation already in progress. 2 men were discussing business matters, their voices distant but clear, talking about stock prices and market predictions. What struck me as odd was their discussion of companies I'd never heard of and terminology that felt outdated. The conversation lasted 10 minutes before dissolving back into static. At first, I thought it was just some obscure talk radio or a ham radio signal picked up by vintage equipment. I noted the frequency and tuned in again the next evening. This time, the voices belonged to a woman and an older man engaged in what sounded like a therapy session. The woman described recurring nightmares of drowning, her voice trembling with a raw emotion that tightened my chest. The therapist responded with techniques I recognized from college psychology classes, but his approach felt archaic. When she mentioned the year 1967, my blood ran cold. I froze in my chair, The room suddenly felt colder despite the heater running full blast. My rational mind tried to find an explanation. Maybe it was some kind of historical radio drama or documentary with recordings from the past. But the conversation felt too intimate, too real, weighed down by genuine human suffering. Over the following nights, I became obsessed with the radio. Each evening I tuned different frequencies, discovering conversations spanning decades. A couple arguing over finances in 1952. Friends planning a camping trip in 1973. A woman confessing an affair to her priest in 1981. The voices were always clear, intimate, and accompanied by specific dates and details that, when I researched online, turned out to be historically accurate. My sleep suffered. I lay awake, haunted by their words long after I turned the radio off. The woman from 1967 especially stayed with me. Her drowning nightmares so vivid I started having similar ones myself. I woke gasping, feeling phantom water flooding my lungs, sheets soaked with sweat that smelled faintly of lake water. Within a week, the toll became physical. My hands trembled, making typing at work difficult. My heart would suddenly race, pounding so hard I feared my colleagues could hear it. I lost weight. My appetite vanished, replaced by a knot of anxiety tightening my stomach until eating felt impossible. But I couldn't stop listening. The breakthrough came on a Thursday night when I discovered I could influence which conversations I heard. By focusing on specific time periods while adjusting the dial, I could navigate through decades of recorded human experience. The realization terrified me more than anything else. This wasn't random static or random radio reception. Something was responding to my intentions, feeding me exactly what I focused on. That night, I heard my own voice. It was a conversation from 3 months ago, a phone call I'd made to my ex-wife during one of my lowest moments. I listened, raw and broken, begging her to reconsider our divorce, my words slurred by alcohol and desperation. The shame burned through me like acid as I heard her gentle but firm rejection. How I'd become someone she no longer recognized. The radio had somehow captured and stored that private moment, along with thousands of others. I plunged into researching the radio's history, diving deeper into Uncle Theodore's past with growing urgency. What I uncovered made my hands tremble as I typed search queries into my laptop. Theodore wasn't the radio's first owner. The device had passed through a series of people over decades, each dying under mysterious, unexplained circumstances. Not violent deaths, but sudden heart attacks in seemingly healthy individuals, strokes striking those with no medical warning. The pattern was clear once I knew where to look. Every owner had become obsessed with the radio before their death, spending increasing amounts of time listening to voices from the past. Neighbors reported erratic behavior, social withdrawal, and complaints of being watched or followed. Several had been found dead in their homes, the radio still playing static in rooms that shouldn't have had power. My own behavior was mirroring theirs. I'd called in sick to work 3 times in the past week, unable to tear myself away from the radio. My apartment had turned into a disaster zone. Takeout containers piled high, clothes unwashed. I'd stopped answering my phone, afraid the radio might capture those conversations too. The voices grew more recent, more familiar. I heard neighbors arguing through thin walls, conversations I'd overheard months ago, now replaying with unnerving clarity. I heard my own voice during job interviews, during chats with friends, during moments I thought were private. The radio wasn't just receiving these conversations. It was somehow connected to every significant moment of human interaction, storing them like a vast library of secrets. Paranoia crept in slowly, then all at once. I began to suspect the radio was broadcasting as well as receiving. Every time I spoke in my apartment, I imagined someone else hearing my words through their own vintage receiver. The thought that my private conversations, my thoughts, might be stored and replayed for unknown listeners made my skin crawl as if invisible insects were crawling beneath it. I started whispering, then stopped speaking aloud altogether when I was home. But the radio seemed to read my thoughts too, tuning itself to conversations that reflected my mental state. When I dwelled on my failed marriage, it played arguments between couples. When I worried about my job, it broadcast discussions about career failures and financial ruin. It was as if the device was reading my mind. Sleep became impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the static from the other room calling to me like a siren song. I resisted for hours, but inevitably found myself padding barefoot across the cold hardwood floor, switching the radio on in the darkness of my living room. The conversations became more disturbing. I heard confessions of crimes, descriptions of violence, admissions of terrible secrets that people had carried to their graves. The radio was drawing me deeper into humanity's darkest corners, exposing the rot hidden beneath the surface of ordinary lives. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed a stranger, hollow-eyed, gaunt, skin pale and cracked like old paper. My hands shook constantly, and a twitch developed in my left eye that made it seem like I was constantly winking at invisible conspirators. My heart hammered with a frantic, uneven rhythm, like a caged bird desperate to escape my chest. The breaking point came on a quiet Sunday morning when my mother's voice emerged through the radio speaker. She was speaking to my father, voicing their worries about my mental health. A conversation from 6 months ago, after my divorce had been finalized. Hearing their concern and love, fractured by the radio's static, something inside me shattered. I understood then that the radio wasn't simply capturing old conversations. It was feeding on them. Every stolen secret, every whispered emotion, every fragile human connection became nourishment for the dark entity living inside its mahogany cabinet. With each passing moment, it grew stronger, while its listeners weakened, draining life from the very act of listening. Uncle Theodore hadn't died naturally. The radio consumed him, body and soul, leaving only an empty shell behind before turning its hunger on me. Knowing this trap didn't make escape any easier. The radio became an addiction more potent than any drug. Even though it was killing me, I found myself returning night after night, compelled to hear one more secret, to uncover one more hidden truth about the people around me. But knowledge has its own power, and I fought back. I researched ways to break obsessive patterns, to resist compulsions beyond my control. I took the radio from my living room, locked it away in a closet, draping it in heavy blankets. When that failed to silence its call, I moved it to the basement storage unit of my apartment building. Withdrawal was brutal. My body ached as if fighting a severe illness. Hallucinations haunted me. Phantom voices drifting through empty rooms, static crackling from devices left off. My hands shook so fiercely I could barely hold a coffee cup without spilling. Yet slowly, piece by piece, I reclaimed myself. I forced myself back to work, to ordinary human interactions that didn't involve stolen whispers from the past. I began exercising again, trying to rebuild the strength the radio had drained from my body. Most importantly, I started speaking with real people in real time, engaging in conversations that belong to the present moment. The radio still waits in storage, its presence a cold spot beneath the building's foundation. A hungry darkness sending tendrils of temptation through the floors. Sometimes late at night, I imagine I hear it calling me through layers of concrete and steel. I've written warnings to those who might inherit it next, though I doubt anyone would believe such a tale. The radio will find its next victim eventually. Devices like this always do. They crave one thing, human connection, the intimate moments that define us. I've learned something important about secrets and forbidden knowledge. Some things are meant to stay buried, locked away with the people who live them. The radio offers the illusion of connection but destroys it, replacing genuine interaction with voyeuristic consumption of stolen intimacies. Sometimes I still wake to phantom static ringing in my ears, feel the pull to return to that basement and resurrect the voices of the dead. But I resist, focusing instead on the living, the conversations that exist here, now, and belong to me. The static may always linger just beneath my consciousness, but I've learned to tune it out, to choose life over whispers from the past. Some frequencies are too dangerous to explore, some voices too costly to hear. The radio taught me the most terrifying truths aren't supernatural, they're human. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is simply choose not to listen. The Grand View had been closed for 15 years by the time I arrived. Its fate undecided, demolition or restoration. A series of unfortunate incidents had driven away the last of its guests. Nothing deadly, they assured me, just complaints of strange noises, doors that wouldn't stay closed, and guests who checked out in the dead of night, wide-eyed and babbling about things that shouldn't exist. Afternoon sunlight slanted through grimy windows, casting long, dusty rectangles across the faded carpet. My footsteps echoed through the vast emptiness as I made my way to the reception desk. The once gleaming marble surface was now dulled by years of neglect. Brass fittings had tarnished to a sickly green, and the guest registry lay open to a page dated March 15, 2009, the hotel's final day of operation. I raised my camera and clicked the shutter. The flash burst, illuminating the room in harsh white light for a brief moment. In that instant, I thought I caught movement in the corner of my eye. But when I turned, there was nothing, only empty doorways and the slow sway of a cobweb stirred by an unfelt breeze. My throat went dry as I swallowed, tasting dust and something else, metallic and stale. The air hung thick, undisturbed for years, yet I could feel subtle currents swirling around me, raising the hairs on my arms. The elevator doors loomed ahead, frozen half open like gaping wounds revealing the darkness of the shaft beyond. I'd already decided to take the stairs. The power had long been cut, and even if it hadn't, I wouldn't trust those ancient cables to hold me. The stairwell beckoned beside the elevators, marked by a small brass placard. Guest floors 2 to 8. As I climbed, my fingers trailed along the banister, coming away coated in a fine layer of dust that shimmered faintly in the dim light filtering down from above. The carpet on the stairs was worn thin in the center, revealing the ghostly outlines of thousands of footsteps. People who had climbed these steps before me, carrying luggage, secrets, and hopes for what awaited them behind their doors. The second-floor hallway stretched before me like a tunnel, lined with doors on either side in perfect symmetry. Tarnished brass plates bore room numbers: 201, 203, 205 on the left, 202, 204, 206 on the right. I raised my camera again, documenting the decay. The peeling wallpaper patterned with faded roses, water stains blooming on the ceiling like brown flowers, and curling carpet edges where they met the walls. Then I heard it, a soft click, like a door latch engaging. I froze, heart pounding. The sound came from somewhere ahead, but I couldn't tell which room. I stood still, listening to the blood rushing in my ears, waiting for the noise to come again. Instead, I heard the slow, deliberate creak of a door opening. My mouth went dry as I watched room 207 swing open, revealing darkness beyond. The movement was smooth, controlled, as if guided by an invisible hand. I found myself drawn forward, feet moving against every instinct to turn and flee. Inside, a woman in a blue dress stood with her back to me, brushing her hair before a vanity mirror. But the mirror didn't reflect her face. It showed the room as it must have been decades ago. Wallpaper fresh and bright, furniture polished to a high shine, late afternoon sunlight pouring through clean windows. She moved slowly, each stroke of the brush deliberate and practiced, as if preparing for an important evening. I blinked hard, pulse racing, and when I opened my eyes, the room was empty again. Dust motes danced in the shaft of light streaming through the grimy window. The vanity was a water-stained shell, its cracked mirror reflecting only fragments of my pale face. The door swung shut with the same soft click I'd heard before. My hands trembled as I raised the camera and snapped a photo of the closed door. Through the viewfinder, it looked normal, just another door in an abandoned hallway. But I could still smell it, a faint trace of perfume and something else. Something warm and alive, out of place in this dead hotel. I moved on to the next door, then the next, photographing each one methodically, trying to focus on my work. But the feeling of being watched clung to me, eyes tracking me from behind every door I passed. When I reached room 213, it opened before me. This time, a man in a business suit sat on the edge of the bed, head buried in his hands, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. On the nightstand beside him lay scattered papers. Legal documents, divorce papers, I guessed, though I couldn't read the words from where I stood. The man looked up, and for a fleeting second, our eyes met across decades. His face was my father's, impossibly young, impossibly real. The camera slipped from my numb fingers, caught only by the strap around my neck. My father had never stayed in this hotel. He'd never even been to this state. He died 2 years ago, in a hospice bed 3,000 miles away. His hand in mine as the machines that kept him breathing fell silent. Yet here he sat, wearing the gray suit he was buried in, eyes full of pain and recognition. "Dad." The word slipped out before I could stop it. The door slammed shut so hard the number placard rattled. I stood trembling, breath shallow and rapid, sweat breaking across my forehead despite the chill. My hands were clammy as I wiped them on my jeans, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Grief, hallucination, my rational mind insisted. Stress and the eerie atmosphere conspiring to conjure false memories and visions. But the smell lingered. My father's cologne, the same brand he'd worn every day for 30 years. I forced myself forward. Each door I passed seemed to pulse with hidden energy, as if the rooms themselves were holding their breath, waiting to reveal their secrets. My heart hammered against my ribs, and I tasted copper where I'd bitten my tongue. Room 219 showed my first apartment, the one I shared with Sarah during our brief marriage. She stood in the kitchenette, back rigid with anger, gesturing at something unseen. I remembered the fight money, the grocery budget spent on camera gear. She'd left that night, taking only what she could carry, never to return. Yet we'd never stayed in any hotel together, let alone this one. Room 225 revealed my childhood bedroom, decorated with superhero posters and the desk where I'd done my homework. I sat there, maybe 8 years old, crying over a failed math test. My mother appeared in the doorway, younger than I remembered, concern etched on her face as she moved to comfort a child who couldn't possibly be there. The pattern continued as I climbed higher. Each room unfolded scenes from my life, mundane and profound, replayed endlessly. My high school graduation, my first day at work, the afternoon I bought my camera, the morning I realized my marriage was over. It was as if the hotel had absorbed not just its guests' memories, but everyone who ever walked its halls. By the 6th floor, sweat soaked my shirt and my legs trembled beneath me. My logical mind screamed that this was impossible, a breakdown born of isolation and oppressive atmosphere. But my senses refused to lie. I smelled my mother's cooking, the musty odor of my old apartment, the antiseptic sting of the hospital where my father died. Room 612 nearly broke me. It showed me standing in this very hallway just moments ago, watching myself discover room 207 for the first time. I was looking at myself, an endless loop that blurred my vision and churned my stomach. The version of me in the room raised his camera. The weight of my own camera grew heavy around my neck. I stumbled backward, my back hitting the wall, sending a spiderweb of cracks across the dusty wallpaper. My breath came in ragged gasps. Black spots danced at the edges of my vision. Hyperventilating, my body's fight-or-flight response surged. Then the truth I'd sensed since arriving settled in. I wasn't here to document the hotel's decay for any historical society. I couldn't remember driving here or receiving a commission. My memories of the outside world felt thin and distant, like half-remembered dreams. The phone number I was supposed to call when the job was done escaped me. The contact's name was a blur. All I could remember was this place, and the endless walk through its haunted halls. I watched these halls, watching doors open and close. How long had I been here? Days? Weeks? The natural light filtering through the windows never seemed to change. I was trapped in the same dusty late afternoon glow that had greeted me when I first entered the lobby. My reflection in the cracked mirror of room 618 revealed the truth. My clothes were clean, my hair neat, my skin unmarked by days of wandering through dust and decay. I looked exactly as I had when I first arrived, whenever that had been. Time wasn't moving normally in this place. It was pulled and stagnant, like water in a forgotten basement. I was one of them now, one of the eternal guests trapped in an endless cycle of the same moments, the same discoveries, the same growing horror. The hotel fed on memory, on the moments that defined us. It had found in me a particularly rich source of nourishment. But unlike the other guests, I was aware of the cycle. I could see the pattern, understand what was happening. And with that understanding came a terrible choice. I could accept it, let myself fade into the routine of endless repetition, become another scene playing out behind another door for some future visitor to discover. Or I could fight it, try to break free from the cycle that held this place together. The elevator shaft called to me from the end of the hall, its darkness promising either escape or oblivion. I walked toward it slowly, my footsteps echoing in the silence. Behind me, I could hear doors beginning to open, all the rooms I'd visited starting their performances again. The sound of my father weeping, my mother's gentle voice, Sarah's angry words, all of it bleeding together into a chorus of memory made manifest. At the threshold of the elevator shaft, I turned back to look at the hallway one last time. Every door stood open now, golden lights spilling from each room and illuminating the corridor like candles in a church. The scenes played out simultaneously, past, present, and future all existing in the same moment. All the moments that had ever mattered reduced to an eternal now. I stepped into the darkness of the shaft, feeling the floor give way beneath my feet. But instead of falling, I found myself standing in the lobby again, my camera heavy around my neck, afternoon sunlight slanting through grimy windows. The guest registry lay open to March 15, 2009. Everything was exactly as it had been when I first arrived. Except now I knew the truth. I was both observer and observed, documenter and documented, guest and exhibition. The hotel had made me part of its collection, and I would spend eternity walking these halls, discovering the same terrible secret over and over again. My own story becoming just another scene for the next visitor to witness through doors that opened and closed on their own. The silence pressed against my eardrums, thick with the weight of abandoned dreams and forgotten conversations. And in that silence, I could feel something watching me from the shadows, something that had been waiting in this place far longer than any guest should. I raised my camera and took my first photograph. I dreamed of walking through tall grass, my feet finding purchase on old stones worn smooth by countless travelers. The dream felt more real than my bedroom, more substantial than the sheets twisted around my sweat-dampened body. Morning brought the first change. I noticed it during my coffee, when the early light transformed my living room into something almost cathedral-like. The path in the painting had shifted, not dramatically, but enough to make my chest tighten. Where yesterday it had curved left toward the oaks, now it bent slightly right, revealing a section I was certain hadn't been visible before. The new portion showed more cobblestones, some cracked and overgrown with moss, leading deeper into what now appeared to be a more extensive forest. My hands shook as I set down my mug. Coffee sloshed across the table, dark liquid spreading like a stain. I approached the painting on unsteady legs, my breath coming in short gasps. Up close, the brush strokes looked undisturbed. The paint was aged and cracked, as if decades old. Yet I knew with the absolute certainty that comes with impending doom that the path had changed. I called in sick to work. The thought of leaving the painting unsupervised filled me with a panic I couldn't rationalize. What if it changed again while I was gone? What if the path moved in ways I couldn't track, leaving me lost in its progression? Throughout that day, I positioned myself in my chair with a notepad, sketching the path's exact configuration every hour. My drawings grew increasingly frantic, my hand cramping from gripping the pencil too tightly. The sketches revealed no changes during daylight hours, but something about the painting's stillness felt expectant, as if it were waiting for nightfall. That evening, I dozed fitfully in my chair rather than retreating to my bedroom. I woke to find pale moonlight streaming through my windows, transforming the painting into something luminous and alive. The path had changed again. It now curved deeper into the forest, revealing glimpses of what might have been structures among the trees. Angular shadows that could have been ruins or buildings so ancient they'd become part of the landscape itself. My mouth went dry. The metallic taste of fear coated my tongue as I realized I could see further along the path than should have been possible within the painting's borders. It was as if the canvas had expanded, though the frame remained unchanged. The painted world was growing, spreading beyond its physical boundaries in ways that made my vision blur and my head pound. I began keeping detailed journals, documenting each alteration with the obsessive precision of a man watching his sanity slip away. The path revealed itself incrementally night after night, like a slow-motion revelation. Sometimes it branched into multiple routes. Other times it narrowed to barely more than a deer trail winding between massive tree trunks whose bark bore strange markings that hurt to look at directly. My appetite disappeared. Food turned to ash in my mouth. My reflection in the bathroom mirror showed hollow cheeks and eyes rimmed with red. Dark circles spread beneath them like bruises, and my skin took on the waxy pallor of someone who hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. When concerned colleagues called, I told them I was fighting a persistent flu. The lie came easily. I felt diseased, infected by something that was slowly consuming me from within. The painting consumed my days and haunted my nights. I moved my sleeping bag to the living room floor, positioning it so I could watch the canvas even in darkness. Sleep became a series of micronaps interrupted by compulsive checking. Each time I opened my eyes, I expected to find the path had advanced further, revealing more of its mysterious destination. 3 weeks after the painting's arrival, I noticed the first change to my house. It started with the wallpaper in my living room. The pattern, small blue flowers on a cream background, began to fade near the painting, not uniformly but in patches that seemed to correspond to the painted meadow's edges. Where my wall met the canvas, the cheerful domestic pattern gave way to something that looked increasingly like weathered plaster, stained and mottled as if exposed to decades of rain and wind. My breathing became shallow and rapid. I pressed my palm against the affected wall, and the surface felt different, rougher somehow, more porous. When I pulled my hand away, my skin was dusty with something that smelled of old leaves and damp earth. The changes accelerated after that. Each morning revealed new transformations that made my heart race and my vision swim with panic. The hardwood floors began to show patches of what looked like compressed soil and scattered pebbles. The ceiling developed stains that resembled cloud formations, complete with the yellowish tinge of the painting's perpetually threatening sky. I stopped answering my phone. The outside world felt increasingly unreal, a distraction from the vital work of documenting my home's metamorphosis. I filled notebook after notebook with observations, my handwriting becoming more erratic as exhaustion and terror took their toll. The words began to move on the page, sometimes rearranging themselves when I wasn't looking directly at them. My furniture changed too. The reading chair's upholstery faded, developing patches that resembled lichen. The coffee tables would grain twisted and curled, growing more gnarled and organic, as if it were slowly returning to the forest that birthed it. Books on my shelves warped and swelled, their pages yellowing, brittle, and filled with text that no longer resembled the stories I remembered. The path in the painting marched forward relentlessly. An entire village had emerged now, or what was left of one. Ancient stone buildings huddled around a central square, their windows dark and hollow. Streets branched from the square in all directions, some disappearing into tunnels that seemed to burrow deep underground. The detail was impossible, far more intricate than any canvas should contain. Yet there it was, expanding before my increasingly bloodshot eyes. I stood closer and closer to the painting each day, my nose nearly touching its surface, trying to peer into those shadowy windows and narrow alleyways. The paint smelled of ozone and decay, like the air before a thunderstorm mixed with the musk of forgotten graves. Sometimes I thought I heard sounds from within, distant footsteps on cobblestones, the creak of ancient doors, whispers in languages I couldn't name. My house was vanishing around me, being consumed, inch by inch, into the painted world. The boundary between my living room and the painted meadow dissolved until I couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Grass sprouted through the floorboards. The scent of wildflowers mixed with the stagnant air of my increasingly tomb-like home. One morning, I woke to find my feet bare and dirty, soil caked beneath my fingernails despite never leaving the house. My clothes reeked of long journeys through wild places. Burrs clung to my hair. The painted path now extended beyond the frame entirely, its cobblestones merging seamlessly with my transformed floor. The village no longer stood empty. Figures moved through its streets, indistinct, distant, but undeniably there. They paused at windows and doorways, turning toward me with faces I couldn't quite see, but somehow recognized. The sensation of being watched was constant, a weight pressing down on my shoulders, crawling along my spine like cold fingers. I tried to leave. My hand reached for the front door handle, but when I turned it, the door opened not onto my familiar street, but onto the painted meadow. Tall grass swayed in a breeze that carried the sound of distant church bells and whispers just beyond hearing. The path stretched before me, its stones worn smooth by countless feet, inviting me to step forward on a journey I knew I would never return from. I slammed the door and backed away, my heart pounding like a caged bird. But the meadow's scent still seeped beneath the threshold, and I could still hear the grass rustling, the wind playing through ancient oak leaves. The walls of my house had become transparent, or perhaps they had simply ceased to exist. Beyond them, the painted landscape extended in all directions. An endless world of meadows, forests, ruins, and villages, all connected by a network of paths branching in patterns too complex for human comprehension. I no longer knew where I ended and the painting began. My reflection in the last unbroken mirror showed a figure turning translucent, dissolving into the canvas realm like everything else. My movements left trails of color lingering in the air, and sometimes I found my thoughts scattered across multiple locations, standing in my living room while also walking the painted streets, existing in both places and neither. The painted figures were closer now, gathering at the edge of the village square. Their faces remained obscured, but I felt their attention like heat from a fire. They gestured toward the deeper paths, beckoning me further into their world. I understood then. The painting hadn't come by accident. It was a doorway, a passage seeking someone like me. Isolated, lonely, desperate enough to ignore all warnings until it was too late. The figures in the square had once stood in rooms of their own, had once opened mysterious packages, had once hung impossible landscapes on their walls. As I write these final words, my notebook rests atop what was once a coffee table and now resembles a moss-covered altar. The pen in my hand feels heavier, more real, as my fingers become translucent. My house is gone, absorbed entirely into the painted world, leaving me suspended in a place between reality and imagination. The path waits, patient. The figures wait, understanding. I can hear my name drifting from the painted streets, spoken in familiar voices like old friends calling me home. I set down the pen and take my first step onto the cobblestone path. The stones are warm beneath my feet, worn smooth by those who came before. Behind me, my old life fades like morning mist. Ahead lies an eternal world of infinite paths, where the only reality is painted in oils and bound by gold leaf. The first morning I noticed them, my coffee went cold in my trembling hands. Grooves in the sand, deeper than any animal track I'd ever seen, stretched from the water's edge to the dunes behind my cottage. Carved, parallel lines wide enough to fit my entire boot were scored into the beach, as if something massive had dragged itself across the shore in the pre-dawn dark. My heart hammered against my ribs as I stood at the kitchen window, watching the early light illuminate the scarred shoreline. The patterns were too deliberate, too precise to be natural. Whatever had made them possessed intelligence, purpose. That realization sent ice through my veins. I backed away from the window, breath fogging the glass in short, panicked bursts. I'd come to Saltmere Cove seeking solitude, fleeing the noise of the city after my divorce. The coastal village had seemed perfect, a handful of weathered houses perched on cliffs above an endless gray Atlantic. My rental cottage sat at the village's edge, close enough to the water that I could hear the waves whispering through the bedroom walls. I hadn't expected to be questioning my sanity before the first week was over. That morning, I forced myself outside to examine the tracks. The salty wind lashed the beach, carrying a smell I couldn't place. Something organic and ancient, like low tide mixed with rust. My boots crunched over seaweed and broken shells as I approached the furrows. Up close, they were worse. The sand hadn't just been displaced. It had been pressed down with immense weight. Small fragments glittered in the grooves, iridescent and scale-like, catching the pale sunlight with unnatural shimmer. I knelt beside one, fingers brushing the cold grit. The fragments felt rough, alien. When I picked one up to inspect it, My skin began to itch violently. A wave of nausea rippled through my gut and I dropped it, watching it vanish into the sand. The sensation lingered, a crawling beneath my skin that made me want to scrub my hands raw. I followed the tracks toward the village. They led past the decrepit pier, where fishing boats bobbed like broken toys, paint peeling and hulls stained with salt and age. As I walked, I became aware of eyes watching from the windows. Curtains twitched. Faces, gaunt, pale and weather-worn, stared with expressions as cold as the cliffs behind them. The general store stood at the village center, its crooked sign groaning in the wind. Inside, the bell above the door gave a discordant clang, and the elderly shopkeeper looked up with eyes the color of storm clouds. When I mentioned the beach tracks, his face drained of color. He mumbled something about storms stirring debris, then turned away, his hands trembling as he rearranged already neat shelves. The dismissal felt rehearsed, hollow. Fear leaked through the cracks of his routine. I left with more questions than answers, and a growing certainty that the villagers knew more than they let on. That night, I lay in bed listening to sounds that didn't belong. Beneath the crash of waves came something else. Deep, rhythmic breathing, as though something vast slumbered just outside my walls. My sleep was fragmented, filled with dreams of black water and eyes the size of dinner plates. In the morning, I found new tracks outside. Smaller this time, more numerous. They radiated from the original furrows like spokes from a wheel, and stopped just short of my front door. My mouth went dry. Whatever had made them had been close enough to touch the windows while I slept. The paranoia began then. I constantly checked the locks, tested windows I'd already sealed. The village felt different, quieter, the air thick with held breath. Conversations died when I entered the shop. I caught fragments of speech in a dialect older than English. My search for answers led to the tiny library above the post office. Cramped shelves held records dating back 300 years. The old compact was mentioned often in brittle pages, alongside references to tithes paid to She Who Rises. The implication was unmistakable. Saltmere Cove had a history of offering tribute to something in the deep. The librarian, a rail-thin woman with hands like driftwood, watched me read with mounting unease. Eventually, she approached and whispered that some knowledge was better left buried. When I pressed her, she insisted the records were only stories meant to frighten children, but her eyes held the same haunted fear I'd seen in the shopkeepers. She locked the archives after I left. The tracks appeared nightly now, increasing in complexity. Spirals and symbols formed in the sand around my cottage, shapes that hurt to look at. Studying them made my vision swim, induced splitting headaches and a nausea that tugged at the edges of my balance. I began photographing them, desperate for proof. But in every image, the beach appeared undisturbed. Just ordinary sand, as if whatever made the markings lived beyond the reach of the lens. Beyond understanding. Sleep became impossible. I lay awake each night, paralyzed, listening to sounds that had no rightful place on this earth. Deep, wet breathing that seemed to rise from the ocean itself, and the scrape of something vast dragging against stone. On the fifth night, I saw movement in the water. A massive shadow shifting beneath the waves, far too deliberate to be a school of fish or drifting debris. It moved in perfect parallel with the shoreline, pacing the land like a predator. I could feel its attention fixed on my cottage, as real and crushing as a physical weight. In the village, the strangeness deepened. Lights appeared in windows at unnatural hours, flickering in patterns too precise to be accidental. Curious, I ventured out once during these displays, only to be met with silent avoidance. The villagers would not look at me. They hurried past with heads bowed and shoulders hunched, as if carrying something they dared not share. It was in the basement of the old church that I uncovered the truth. Forgotten records left to molder, handwritten across decades in multiple scripts. They spoke of a covenant, forged in 1847, when ships had begun vanishing in numbers too great to dismiss. The villagers had made a bargain with something beneath the waves, offering tributes in exchange for safe passage. Livestock at first, then more complicated rituals aligned with the tide. The final pages, dated only months before my arrival, chilled my blood. They described increasing dissatisfaction from the deep dweller. The old offerings no longer sufficed. It wanted something new, something alive and unaware. A fresh soul drawn in by its own curiosity. The last entry spoke of a cottage prepared for the chosen vessel, someone to complete the pact unknowingly. My hands trembled as I read, icy realization coursing through me. I wasn't a chance visitor. I had been summoned, lured here by design. Every strange sound, every track in the sand, had been part of the ritual, each step a lure drawing me deeper into a centuries-old arrangement. I stumbled from the church, dry heaving into the shadows as the weight of it all sank in. The cottage's perfect location at the shoreline, the smiling real estate agent who'd reached out to me out of nowhere, just after my divorce, when I was most vulnerable. The rent too generous to question. It had all been orchestrated. I raced back to the cottage and began to pack in blind panic. But then I noticed the tracks again. They no longer led to the ocean. Instead, they encircled the cottage, forming a perfect ring. The sand within had darkened, dampened, as though the ocean floor itself had risen to greet the land. My car keys were gone. I searched every drawer, every crevice, nothing. I had left them on the counter beside my wallet the night before. Now they had vanished. The landline produced only a strange rushing sound, like water echoing through endless caverns. My mobile, which had worked flawlessly, now displayed no signal. Night fell unnaturally fast, as if the sun had simply dropped from the sky. Through the windows, I saw the village lights again. Not warm, yellow lamps, but an eerie blue-green radiance that pulsed from the very buildings. The villagers moved as one now, their pace too uniform, too synchronized, like puppets responding to a silent command. Then the breathing returned, louder, closer. The waves pulled back from the shore, revealing broad swathes of slick seafloor, glinting in the unnatural light. And within that wet sand, I saw the origin of the tracks. Deep furrows carved by something impossibly large, emerging from unimaginable depths. I pressed myself against the far wall, flashlight in hand, heart hammering in my chest like a trapped bird. Sweat poured from my brow despite the cold. Something moved in the surf, no longer a shadow, but a massive form that displaced the waves as it approached the shore. The sounds that followed defied description. Wet, slithering slides, the crack of joints the size of ancient trees. The cottage began to tremble, not from wind, but from the footfalls of something immense. Then silence. Utter, unnatural silence. Even the ocean ceased its eternal crashing, as if it too were holding its breath. In that oppressive stillness, I heard only my own heartbeat and the rasp of terrified breathing. Then came a knock at the door. Not the light tap of human knuckles, but a slow, deliberate pounding. Something solid striking wood in measured beats. 13 knocks. Then silence. Moments later, the same pattern resumed. 13 beats. The rhythm precise, patient. I didn't move, couldn't move. Every fiber of my being was taut with dread. Then came the third sequence, and with it, a voice. It was not human. It spoke in that same ancient dialect I had heard whispered by the villagers. An alien tongue made of salt and stone and endless, crushing depths. Though I couldn't understand the language, the meaning was clear enough. An invitation, a summons, a final call to fulfill whatever compact my presence had completed. The cottage's front door began to glow with that same blue-green light I'd seen throughout the village. The wood itself seemed to become translucent, and through it I saw a shape that defied description. Massive, fluid, ancient beyond measure. It waited with the patience of deep tides and geological time, knowing that whatever had brought me here would eventually compel me to respond. But understanding the trap meant I could also recognize its limitations. The villagers' fear, their careful avoidance of direct involvement, suggested that whatever power they'd invoked required willing participation. I could feel the compulsion working on my mind, a growing urge to open the door and accept whatever role had been assigned to me. The urge felt foreign, intrusive, like fingers made of cold water probing the inside of my skull. I fought against it, focusing on my own thoughts, my own will. The cottage shook again, and I heard the sound of wood beginning to splinter. But I also heard something else. A change in the breathing, a note of frustration, or perhaps uncertainty. The blue-green light began to flicker, and the shape beyond the door seemed less solid, more fluid. Dawn approached with agonizing slowness, but as the first gray light touched the horizon, the presence outside began to withdraw. The breathing faded, replaced gradually by the familiar sound of waves against sand. The glow disappeared from the cottage walls, and the oppressive weight pressing against my thoughts lifted like morning fog. I waited until full daylight before approaching the windows. The beach was empty, unmarked by any tracks. The village appeared normal, smoke rising from chimneys, boats bobbing peacefully in the harbor. But I knew the normality was temporary, a pause between movements in an ancient dance. My car keys lay on the kitchen counter exactly where I'd originally placed them, as if they'd never been missing. My phone showed full signal strength. Everything had been restored, but the restoration felt like a reprieve rather than a release. I packed quickly and left Saltmere Cove before noon, driving without stopping until I reached the city. But even now, months later, I find myself checking the news for reports from that stretch of coast. And sometimes when I look out at any body of water, a lake, a river, even a full bathtub, I think I can see movement in the depths. Something vast and patient that has learned my scent and knows exactly where to find me when the time comes to complete what was started in that isolated village. The tracks may be gone from the beach at Saltmere Cove, but I carry their pattern with me now, carved into my memory with the same precision that something immense once used to mark the sand. And in my dreams, I still hear that ancient breathing, waiting for my return. Every nerve in my body screamed that I wasn't alone. The station's main entrance hung open, its heavy wooden door askew on rusted hinges. Inside, the waiting room stretched further than seemed possible, filled with rows of wooden benches that disappeared into darkness. A ticket window sat behind iron bars, its glass spiderwebbed with cracks. Behind it, I saw the vague outline of what might have been a person. But when I approached, I realized it was just a coat hanging on a hook, swaying slightly in a breeze I couldn't feel. My skin crawled as I explored the building. Every footstep echoed strangely, as if the sound was being repeated from somewhere else. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and my breath began to mist. In one corner, I found a departure board with letters and numbers that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. They spelled out destinations I'd never heard of, with arrival times that made no sense. Some in the past, some impossibly far in the future. When I finally made my way back outside, my blood turned to ice. The train was exactly where I'd left it, but it looked different somehow. Older. Rust streaked its sides, and the windows were fogged from the inside, as if someone had been breathing on them. As I got closer, my stomach clenched with a sick realization. The door I'd exited through was no longer there. The entire side of the car was smooth, unbroken metal. Panic clawed its way up my throat as I circled the train, searching for any way back inside. My hands shook as I ran them along the cold metal, looking for a handle, a latch, anything. But the train had become a sealed tomb. My breathing turned ragged, each intake burning my lungs as the fog seemed to press closer, reducing my world to just a few feet in any direction. That's when I saw them. Figures stood motionless in the fog. Barely visible shapes that might have been people or might have been tricks of light and shadow. They didn't move when I stared directly at them, but I could swear they shifted position when I looked away. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my fingertips as I counted them. 5, then 7, then more appearing from the gray void. I stumbled backwards, my feet sliding on the wet platform, and suddenly I was running. The fog seemed to part before me and close behind, creating a tunnel through which I fled blindly. My lungs burned as I gasped for air that felt too thin, too cold. Behind me I heard nothing. No footsteps, no pursuit. But the silence was worse than any sound would have been. When I finally stopped, chest heaving and legs trembling, I found myself back at the train, the exact same position where I'd started. Even the door I'd been unable to find moments before was there again, hanging open like a mouth waiting to swallow me whole. My mind reeled as I stared at the impossible sight. I had run in a straight line, I was certain of it. There had been no turns, no curves in the platform. Yet here I was, back where I'd begun, as if the station had folded in on itself. I forced myself to board the train again, hoping, praying, that it would start moving, that this nightmare would end. But as I settled into my seat, the same one where I had awakened, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. On the window beside me, someone had traced words in the condensation. "You can't leave." The letters were fresh, the glass still warm from whatever finger had written them. I spun around, scanning the empty car, but found nothing. Only row after row of vacant seats. My skin felt like it was crawling with insects as I turned back to the window. The words had changed. "We've been waiting." A low rumble filled the car as the train lurched into motion. Relief flooded through me, until I looked outside and realized we were moving backward, retracing the same route I had just walked. The platform slid past in reverse, the station building growing larger instead of smaller. When the train finally stopped again, I was back at the exact same spot. The pattern repeated itself over and over. Sometimes I would explore different parts of the station, finding rooms filled with rotting luggage or corridors that led to dead ends. Sometimes I would see the figures in the fog more clearly. Tall, thin figures in old-fashioned clothing stood perfectly still whenever I looked at them. But the moment I turned away, I could feel them shifting, drawing closer. It didn't matter what I did or which direction I went. Every path led me back to the same station platform, the same train, the same seat. Time dissolved into nothing. My watch had stopped, its hands frozen at the moment I first awoke, and I had no way of knowing if minutes, hours, or days had passed. Hunger gnawed at my stomach. My mouth felt like it had been packed with sand, each breath dry and rasping. But still I moved, propelled by a desperate need to escape whatever trap I had stumbled into. With each cycle, the figures in the fog grew bolder. They moved closer, drifting toward the platform like shadows with weight. I could make out their faces now, pale, gaunt, with eyes that reflected the flickering lamplight like dull mirrors. They never spoke, never made a sound, but I felt their attention like a pressure on my chest. Sometimes I would find messages scrawled in the dust on the station windows, always in that same precise, neat handwriting. "Join us. Stay. You belong here." My sanity began to fray. I caught myself whispering to the empty air, begging whatever force had ensnared me to let me go. I scoured every inch of the station, desperate for an answer, a clue, anything. In the station master's crumbling office, I found an old logbook, its pages filled with entries spanning decades. Each entry was written in a different hand, but all told the same story. Passengers who had missed their stop, who had awakened alone on the train, who had tried, again and again, to leave. The final entry was mine. I stared at the page in disbelief, tracing the familiar shape of my own handwriting. Day unknown. Still trying to escape. The others are patient. They know I'll understand eventually. A sick understanding took root. The fog wasn't holding me here. I was. Some buried part of my mind didn't want to leave. Maybe I'd been running from something in my life, something too heavy to face. Maybe the train had offered me the perfect escape. And now I was trapped in that choice. The figures weren't monsters. They were waiting for me to accept what I already knew but couldn't admit, that I belonged here. In this liminal place between moments, where time meant nothing and nothing was expected of me. I stood once more on the platform, maybe the 100th time. The figures surrounded me, nearer than ever before. Their faces were no longer frightening. They were familiar. People like me, travelers who had boarded the wrong train at the wrong time and, when faced with the choice, had decided to stay. One of them, a woman in a faded blue dress, raised her hand in a gesture I couldn't quite place. Greeting or farewell. Her lips moved, though no sound emerged. Still, I understood her perfectly. Welcome home. The fog began to lift. For the first time since this began, I could see past the edge of the station. There, in the distance, stretched real train tracks. They shimmered beneath a horizon tinged with sunlight, the promise of life beyond the fog. Life and all the messy complications I'd worked so hard to avoid. I had a choice to make. I could board the train again and try to break the cycle. Force myself back into a world of consequences, fears, and responsibilities. Or I could remain here, in this silent, unchanging place, where nothing hurt, where nothing demanded. The train whistle echoed faintly across the mist. The platform vibrated beneath my feet. The woman in blue gave me a small, sad smile and turned away, stepping into the fog like someone who had all the time in the world. I closed my eyes, and I made my choice.